This is the Sneetches, an explanation as to why I, Mr. Curry, read a children's book, to a bunch of high school seniors and asked them to interpret what they saw or what they heard. So, as promised, here's the explanation. And, of course, there's our cover of our book. And there's Ted Geisel, or Theodore Seuss Geisel, better known to all of us as Dr. Seuss. A couple things about Mr. Geisel that we should know. Ted Geisel was born in America, but of German descent. His family had come over in the late 1800s, and as a German in the early 1900s, growing up, he experienced a tremendous amount of prejudice toward himself, just like a number of other Germans in America did. Remember what was going on at the time in Europe, and of course the United States had to leave their policy of isolationism and get involved in World War I, and then again in World War II. The Germans weren't exactly our best friends, so Theodore Geisel experienced a tremendous amount of prejudice as a child growing up during World War I. You'll see how he doesn't face that same prejudice during World War II because of the position that he takes, and we'll talk about that in a little while. Even though he tells himself during World War I and while he's growing up in this environment that he will find a way to treat all people with the same respect that all people deserve, as a young cartoonist, he does fall prey to the prejudices of the day and does make a number of political cartoons that are very, especially today, politically incorrect. I would certainly, love to show you some of these cartoons. However, they would be inappropriate. Some of them would be shocking, absolutely shocking to you to see these things. I wasn't able to find them online. I did find them in a book, and I can see why they're not easy to find, because they are completely offensive toward African Americans and completely opposite to the direction that he's going to go later in his career. So he does fall victim to the prejudices of the day during the early 1900s. Even growing up in a very liberal area around Boston, Massachusetts, in the Springfield area, he is still growing up with these prejudices. Boston is, though a liberal city, was also very racist, so you could see where some of this came from. During World War II, Ted Geisel got a job drawing as a cartoonist for a very liberal newspaper called PM. This is in April of 1941. While a cartoonist for this paper, this liberal paper, part of his job, he felt, was to try to convince Americans that the right thing to do was to go to war. And one of the observations that he made while drawing for this newspaper was that how could we justify fighting overseas to protect the Jews from Nazi oppression without seeing the need to change the way that minorities, especially people of color in America, were treated here in this country. So even by 1941, he starts to see the light as compared to the earlier political cartoons that he had done, which, as I said, were just awful. In 1942, in June, he began addressing the issue of racial prejudices in his cartoons. And one of the cartoons I found, I believe I have in here, there it is, is Governor Talmadge of Georgia. And he normally didn't draw people, specific people. He drew his own kind of people, as I'm sure many of you have seen so many of his books. He tended to stay away from humans. He changed everybody's appearances to make them his own creations. But this was one of the few times that he actually gave in and did draw someone. And apparently, and I don't have a picture of Governor Talmadge, but apparently, according to the reading that I did, this was pretty dead on. He actually hit him pretty good. And you can see the statement he's making there with a whip in his hand. He makes his point pretty clear. Also in 1942, Ted Geisel joins the Army. And interestingly, his job in the Army is to create propaganda films. Now, in these films, his job is to promote reasons to hate the enemy. Now, again, this is kind of contradictory to what he had told himself and where he's going to go with the Sneetches, in the sense that he has to convince people to hate the Japanese and to hate Germans, the Nazis especially. But people in America had a hard time distinguishing the difference between a Nazi and a German. Nazi, of course, being a political party within Germany, but had become dominant. And in case you forgot, he's German, and he experienced tremendous racial prejudice against himself during World War I. So, again, this is kind of an ironic situation that he's in. In 1951, just to move along now, Oliver Brown and his daughter Linda, supported by the NAACP, they sued the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, for refusing to admit Linda, his daughter, to the white elementary school that was 7 blocks from their house. The Board of Topeka, Kansas, the school board, insisted that she walk a mile through a railroad switchyard to attend a black school, which was, the mile was the shortcut. On a good day, any kid, elementary level kid, running around through a railroad switchyard back then, of course, it's very dangerous. In all of the lower court decisions, they upheld the separate but equal rulings from the earlier Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision. And this was appealed to the Supreme Court in 1952. However, they failed to reach any kind of a decision out of this. The Supreme Court will hear this case again in 1953 in December. Now, we'll come back to that in a second. In the summer of 1953, as you can see up in the top there, this is an earlier version of the Sneetches. In July of 53, I believe it was, a 3-stanza poem titled The Sneetches appears in a Red Book, and it's written by a man named Dr. Seuss. The book version, of course, is written in 1961, and so that's 8 years later. One of the famous quotes from that Sneetches poem that appeared in Red Book, which I will find, I haven't found it yet, but I will. The quote is, "And really, it's sort of a shame, for except for those stars, every Sneetch is the same." So you can see he's in this little poem in Red Book magazine. He's already starting to become the Dr. Seuss that we will all know and love later on. In the original poem, just a side note, there was no Sylvester McMonkey McBean. There was no star on-off machine. Again, it was only a 3-stanza poem. He didn't have the time or the space to just create this huge work like he does in his book. And the plain belly Sneetches don't stand around dejected, as they do many times in the book. Actually, in the actual poem, they throw dreadful things at the star-bellied heads, like oysters and clams and the springs of old beds. And also at the end, another difference between the poem and the book that gets released later, there is no resolution to the prejudice. At the end, all the Sneetches are the same and they're equal, whether they have stars or not. It doesn't matter. Well, in the poem, that wasn't the case. There was no resolution, and it actually got violent, as you heard. The origins of that actual Red Book Sneetches poem goes back as far as Judge magazine in 1930, where he drew a cartoon of turtles and mock turtles who resembled each other so closely that no one has the slightest idea whom he is fighting. So you can see the idea was already brewing in 1930. In 53, he has it published in Red Book as a poem, and by 1961, it is a full-blown story appearing in the book that I read from, The Sneetches and Other Stories. In January of 1954, Ted Geisel gives a book to his publisher that many of you may be familiar with a lovable elf. That's Horton. And Horton is the antithesis of the star-belly Sneetch. He hears a cry for help, and he cares only that some little person is shaking, some poor little person is shaking with fear. And without knowing anything about the endangered being's race, religion, sex, nationality, anything about him, Horton realizes to himself, I'll just have to save him because, after all, a person's a person, no matter how small. There's Horton. I'm sure you know Horton. So you can see with the combination of the book, The Sneetches, or the poem of The Sneetches in 53, and Horton, written in 54, you can see the ideas are coming alive here, and if you're keeping track, he's ahead of the civil rights movement by a little bit, by a couple of years. Continuing in our timeline, 1954 in May, the Supreme Court, in a unanimous 9-0 decision, concludes that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. This was a quote from Justice Warren, who wrote the opinion. And then Horton is released in August, a couple months later, in 1954. So he is ahead of America by a good year. He's ahead of Rosa Parks. He's ahead of the bus boycott. 2 years ahead of the Emmett Till tragedy. In the end, the point of this book is simple. He wanted children to grow up already knowing what it took him several decades to recognize. Remember, he faced that prejudice. Then he used it in his cartoons against people. Then he drew political cartoons against segregation and racism. And then he created propaganda films against Germans and Japanese. And then he turns the corner and has the Sneetches poem and Horton Hears a Who, and then eventually the Sneetches as a much longer story. One other side note, and there's of course, the headline of the High Court banning segregation in public schools in 54. One other side note, and what many of you may have written about, is something that Ted Geisel was very afraid of, and that's this. Remember, he was a German, and he was not Jewish. So for those who know what that star means, that is the Star of David. And Jews in Europe, while the Nazis had tried to take over all of Europe, especially in Poland and in Germany and other Austria and other areas that were very anti-Semitic, Jews were forced to wear that Star of David to identify themselves as Jews. And one of the fears that Ted Geisel had when he wrote the book and drew the Sneetches was that people were going to assume that the star in the belly was somehow, some way representing the stars that the Jews had to wear. And being a German, he was afraid that this was going to be the way it was looked at and translated. And luckily the book was read as a kid's book more than anything. But there were a number of people who picked up the social and political implications behind it. And this never really became a big issue for him, luckily. So I hope I hope your papers were good. I hope you enjoyed listening to the story that was read to you and writing the one-page paper. I'm sure there was probably tons of ideas going through your mind as to what you could write and who represented who and this and that. But in the end, it represents segregation and racism. And whether it's civil rights being violated for Germans during World War I in America, Japanese in internment camps, Native Americans in America, it doesn't matter. It's wrong anyway. And Dr. Seuss wanted to make that clear to children at a young age and help put that in their minds from the time they were little and let them grow up knowing that instead of having to learn it later on in life.